I'm not making any kind of, claims or assumptions about what occurred during that meeting, but, those are the kinds of investigative leads or relevant facts that would at least seem worthy of investigating from a law enforcement perspective, considering that these are people who, in Fulton County, it's been alleged were a part of a overarching conspiracy to overturn the results of the election, that Coffee County was a part of that.
I'm Benjamin Wittes, and this is the Lawfare podcast, December 1st, 2023. Anna Bauer is a legal fellow at Lawfare and our Fulton County Correspondent, and as you probably know, has been digging into the weird events in Coffee County in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Her latest tome on the subject is entitled What the GBI Missed in Coffee County, and is about the Georgia State investigation, the report on which clocks in at almost 400 pages, but is a great deal less impressive than it may seem at first glance. Anna joined me in the virtual jungle studio to talk about the GBI's investigation of the Coffee County caper. What did they do? What didn't they do? Did they add any new information? They actually did, but they also left out a whole lot of stuff that any reasonable investigator would want to look at. It's the Lawfare podcast, December 1st. Anna Bauer critiques the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. All right, I want to start with the initials GBI, because people know what the FBI is, and they know lots of three-letter initials being government agencies that do investigations. But what is the GBI, and why should anyone care?
The Georgia Bureau of Investigation is a statewide investigative agency, a law enforcement agency. It's basically the equivalent of the FBI, but at the state level. The GBI typically conducts investigations that have elements of it that go beyond just the county level, right? So it typically will conduct, some of the more complex investigations in the state of Georgia. It is kind of the investigative arm of the Attorney General's office within the state of Georgia. Our Attorney General is Chris Carr, who is a Republican Attorney General. And so that's what the GBI stands for. In terms of why should anyone care, do you mean why should anyone care about this specific investigation?
Well, normally we don't sort of do a whole lot with state police agencies at Lawfare. How did the GBI get wrapped up in something that Lawfare would care about?
Right. So it takes a little bit of backstory, a little bit of explaining, but I'm going to try to keep it short and give you just the short version of it. There was a voting systems breach in Coffee County, Georgia, that folks might be familiar with because it has appeared in the Fulton County indictment in Fulton County, Georgia, brought by District Attorney Fani Willis. It is a part of that sprawling RICO indictment. It's one of the alleged kind of aspects or prongs of that conspiracy. It is something that occurred in January of 2021, the day after the attack on the Capitol. It involved local officials, Kathy Latham, Misty Hampton, a bail bondsman named Scott Hall. All of those folks were indicted in Fulton County in August. And then, of course, it was alleged that Sidney Powell paid for that work through her Defending the Republic charity. There were also additional breaches that occurred throughout the month of January 2021. And this breach kind of was uncovered over the course of a year or two in civil litigation in this election security case called Curling versus Raffensperger, which is an ongoing case over the security of voting systems in the state of Georgia. And when it came to light in February of 2022, it's something that the Secretary of State's office seemed to drag its feet on a little bit in terms of investigating. But eventually, enough evidence came to light that they were prompted to ask the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to get involved in August of 2022, some, 6 months after it first came to light publicly in February of 2022. And then following the involvement of the GBI, at the same time, we had this parallel investigation that was going on with a special grand jury in Fulton County, which was brought by Fani Willis. And as the civil litigation started learning more facts about what had occurred in Coffee County, and it seemed to be that there were people who were maybe involved in this alleged RICO conspiracy who were also involved in Fulton County. It's at that point that Fani Willis became interested in it. They started subpoenaing people to come before the special grand jury. So they carried out this separate investigation. And then, of course, though, the GBI had this other parallel investigation. And I think the reason why it matters is there's been this alleged crime in Fulton County, Georgia, about a conspiracy that involved the president's legal team and local officials who were loyal to the then president. And they conspired allegedly to unlawfully access voting systems data in the state of Georgia and then distribute that data. And so there's this question of, well, did the GBI investigate it fully? And that matters because the Fulton County indictment has always been somewhat jurisdictionally limited and then also limited in terms of the resources that a county district attorney has to investigate, the full extent or the full scope of what occurred in Coffee County.
All right. So you recently acquired a copy of the GBI report itself, and we published it on Lawfare. Some other reporters wrote about it as well. What can you tell us about what the GBI did and what the report is?
Right. So the GBI investigated for approximately 13 months, though I will say that Attorney General Chris Carr has said that his office has received the report, but they continue to coordinate with the GBI. So there's some question about whether maybe there's ongoing investigative work that's going on. I am not apprised of those details because they are not public, and the Attorney General's office, has not commented a whole lot publicly about what's going on or a timeline or kind of some of the details about its investigative strategy at this point. But they wrapped up their investigation shortly after the Fulton County District Attorney in August brought that sprawling RICO indictment that included the Coffee County prong of the conspiracy. It's a 392-page report. Over those 13 months, a very small, maybe 3 or 4 person investigative team interviewed approximately 15 witnesses, although it kind of depends on how you count what an interview is, because there were some briefing meetings that they had with, for example, the Secretary of State's office, who, when I was counting these witnesses, I didn't really include that because that's more of a briefing rather than, a witness interview. But regardless, they interviewed about 15 witnesses. Most of those witnesses were people who were Coffee County level individuals, as opposed to, folks who might be connected more towards the Trump campaign's post-election efforts. And they produced this report that is largely based on review of documents and depositions from the Curling versus Raffensperger case, which is the civil litigation that I mentioned, where this started coming to light. The reason for that being that there's a question about how the Coffee County breach could have implications for the security of elections in Georgia. The Secretary of State's office has kind of minimized that argument, but the plaintiffs in that case who are trying to get Georgia to switch to hand-marked ballots and want to move away from Dominion machines, they have argued, that this reflects on the so-called dangers of using the Dominion voting systems in Georgia, although they have very different arguments from, the arguments that people have raised in the context of the 2020 election and that kind of stuff. So they reviewed this evidence from the Curling versus Raffensperger case. They also reviewed a very small number of depositions from the January 6th committee. That was Giuliani's deposition and Sidney Powell's deposition, as well as the January 6th committee's final report. And then they did have, a few things that they did that were unique or independent to the GBI's investigation. After, almost a year of investigating, they ultimately obtained a search warrant to get the contents of Misty Hampton's computer in the Coffee County Elections Office. Misty Hampton, of course, is the former elections supervisor who is one of the people who allegedly allowed this copying and distribution of the elections data to occur in the month of January 2021. And there was some question about whether the entire board potentially had authorized the work, whether Misty Hampton authorized the work. There were these vague references to this so-called written invitation to come in and copy the data that Sullivan Strickler, the forensic firm, did copy. And so the GBI was able to obtain that so-called written invitation, which maybe we can talk about a little bit more at some point, Ben. But suffice to say, I've written previously that written invitation is not actually, in fact, a written invitation. So I think that summarizes what the GBI did in those 13 months.
Okay, so it is fair to say that you have some reservations about this report as a piece of work product. So at the highest level of altitude, we're going to go into all the details, but at a high level of altitude, what's the problem from your point of view?
Well, I think the problem is that over a more than year-long investigation, the GBI failed to investigate key witnesses, and they also omitted details that I think are really relevant to some of the investigative questions that they left unanswered. So, the first and foremost is, how exactly did several local officials in a rural county in South Georgia get connected to the then president's legal team? That is a question that is something that really no one has quite been able to precisely answer. And through that civil litigation in the Curling versus Raffensperger case, of course, they're limited in terms of, what civil litigants can do or what questions they're asking. They have their own, agenda, their own kind of things that they're doing in depositions in that case that is very different from what maybe a criminal law enforcement agency would be doing. And so I kind of expected that maybe the GBI would be answering some of those questions that are relevant to this question of who was involved in this conspiracy, when did the plan first arise, and how did any of these alleged conspirators sort of all come together, and how were they connected? And the GBI seems to have been quite potentially uninterested in answering those questions because, as I said, it didn't try to seek interviews with many key witnesses, and it mainly just kind of looked at the civil litigation documents and the January 6th committee report rather than doing its own investigative work to get to the bottom of some of these questions.
All right, we're going to dive deep into those deficiencies in a moment, but let's start by giving the devil or the GBI its due. And you did note one area where it made a real contribution, which is that it seems to have answered the question of what the story behind the written invitation is. So let's start there. And why does the written invitation matter, and what in fact happened?
Right. So the written invitation mattered to some extent. If people might recall that when Sidney Powell was indicted, and still before she pleaded guilt, she's now pleaded guilty to some charges related to the Coffee County breach. But when she was, litigating her case prior to that plea agreement, she was making arguments that the copying and distribution that occurred in January 2021, which she had paid for, was authorized by the County Board of Elections, or at least that it was under the color of authorization through the election supervisor, who is not a member of the Board of Elections there, but who is a kind of administrative person, a clerk of sorts. She made this argument that, they believed they had lawful authorization because there was this written invitation. In the Curling versus Raffensperger case, there were also these references that came out through text messages that were produced by the forensics company Sullivan Strickler. There was a woman named Catherine Freese, who is a attorney who worked very closely with Rudy Giuliani during the post-election efforts in 2020 for the Trump campaign. She, had sent this text message to a Sullivan Strickler employee in which she said, "Yay, we have access to Coffee County systems and we received it by written invitation, exclamation point, exclamation point." And so there was this question of, what did this written invitation say? Could it potentially be something that exonerated to some extent any of these people insofar as maybe they thought they had authorization from the County Board of Elections or some kind of local official? So what the GBI did is, again, as I mentioned, they got a search warrant. They recovered the documents on Misty Hampton's email from the elections office. The written invitation, as it turns out, is something that was written in response to an open records request, or a purported open records request from an attorney named Preston Halliburton. Remember that name because we will probably talk about him in a little bit. He is an attorney who is a Georgia-based attorney who represented Giuliani at some of these state legislative hearings that occurred during the month of December of 2020, when Giuliani was going before state legislators in Georgia trying to convince them that there was reason to call a special session to overturn the results of the election based on allegations of voter fraud that were, of course, not true. So Misty Hampton responds to this so-called open records request from Preston Halliburton, and I wrote a Lawfare article about it, kind of explaining in more detail as to why it's not something that could be construed as authorizing what actually took place in terms of the copying of virtually every component of the voting system in Coffee County's elections office. But what she said, in effect, was, y'all are welcome to come to our office anytime, and we can help you in any way in accordance with Georgia law. Of course, the relevant statutes and elections code does not just allow an election supervisor to invite in, third parties
to steal their software.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of, I think that explains what the key kind of contribution of the GBI's investigation was recovering that document.
All right. The body of your article is about the things that the GBI didn't do and about how much stuff there is in the public record, or not quite in the public record, but nothing a little Facebook stalking wouldn't reveal, or nothing that picking up the phone and calling somebody, the most consensual of consensual interviews wouldn't reveal. So without repeating the entire article, because it's, 6,500 words long, what are the big things that the GBI does not appear to have even investigated? It seems like there are sort of 3 or 4 of them. Give us an overview of what and I'll break in and kind of ask for more on some of them. But what are the big areas where they just seem to have dropped the ball?
Right. So I would say one big area is kind of the events leading up to the breach on January 7th, 2021, and then throughout the month of January as well. So it starts with this engagement agreement that Sidney Powell made with Sullivan Strickler, the forensics firm, in, I want to say it's November of 2020 after the election. That was for work in Michigan and Arizona. And then it just skips ahead to New Year's Eve when Preston Halliburton, the attorney that I mentioned, is sending this so-called open records request, and Misty Hampton is, responding with the purported written invitation. But it doesn't really give you any sense of how did any of these people, a bail bondsman from Georgia, the president's attorneys, a local GOP official, how did any of these people, how were they connected? What were some of the events that led up to the breach that might be relevant? And I think that the kind of sequence of events that I pinpointed in the piece is this trip that Kathy Latham, who is the then Coffee County GOP chair, who would, on January 7th, escort the forensics team into the elections office. There are videos showing that. She made this trip from approximately December 16th to December 18th, 2020, which is right around the same time that the Trump team was kind of, at a very critical time. They were on the hunt for access to voting machines. There is that so-called unhinged White House meeting that occurs. And based on the January 6th committee depositions, we know that there was one plan that came from folks like Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn, who wanted Trump to sign an executive order, which would allow the federal government to seize state voting machines. And then on the other hand, there are these references from Powell and from Derek Lyons that suggest that Rudy Giuliani proposed a different plan, which was voluntary access to voting machines in Georgia. And again, I don't want to get too in the weeds with it, but what I found is that it apparently seems to be the case that when Kathy Latham was in D.C. at that time, the night before that December 18th meeting when these things are being discussed, she had a meeting with Rudy Giuliani. And that seems like, and I'm not making any kind of, claims or assumptions about what occurred during that meeting, but, those are the kinds of investigative leads or relevant facts that would at least seem worthy of investigating from a law enforcement perspective, considering that these are people who, in Fulton County, it's been alleged were a part of a overarching conspiracy to overturn the results of the election, that Coffee County was a part of that.
Right. So the broad point is that from reading the GBI report, you would think that the conspiracy starts with the retention of Sullivan Strickler in November and then skips to the right around the new year, and left out is this whole saga that you kind of unfold about how Kathy Latham came to be in Washington and meeting with the very people, as it turns out, who are then presenting to the president the idea of a consensual seizure of state voting equipment in Georgia. And all of this is available without subpoenas, you didn't have subpoena power. Where were you getting this information?
No, I mean, I wrote a previous piece on some of these details in which I looked at the January 6th committee depositions, but in this new piece that I've written, the reporting is based on, voluntary interviews. I just called up an attorney in Georgia who attended this, tour group that Kathy Latham originally is the reason purportedly why she went to DC at that time. And I talked to him. He said that he knew that Kathy Latham at that time, or he learned after they got back from their trip that Kathy Latham had been meeting with Sidney Powell while they were in DC. He described her behavior as she disappeared a lot. He thought it was very odd in retrospect. He did not ever hear anything about her meeting with Giuliani, but just based on social media posts that I was able to find and piece together some of the timeline of this based on the dates that she was in DC. She herself said in a Facebook comment that we unearthed that she had, quote, had a meeting with Mayor Giuliani in December of 2020 while she was on this trip.
And she wasn't just in the same city. She was staying in the Willard Hotel. She was where Giuliani was helping run the famous war room. There are pictures of her they clearly crossed paths. And then she shows up in Georgia, and then he goes off and starts saying, well, we can get this stuff consensually. It is highly suggestive and circumstantial evidence that this trip is a pivotal thing where this idea gets cooked up. All right, so that's basket number one. Kathy Latham goes to Washington, where she got to see the Christmas trees and the National Christmas Tree, and got to visit the Bible Museum, and got to meet with Rudy Giuliani. What is basket number two?
Well, basket number two is this legislative hearing that occurs in Georgia on December 30th of 2020. So maybe like 12 days after Kathy Latham is in DC, where she crosses paths with Powell and Giuliani and Flynn and all these people, and there's all these discussions.
And this is a public legislative hearing, right?
Right.
You don't need to do any sleuthing, or you don't need to subpoena anybody. It was pretty clear what was going on.
Right. It's pretty clear what was going on. You can literally watch it on YouTube. They have the whole hearing. I watched it on a Facebook Live from one of the participants. But the reason that this hearing is important, Ben, is because it has Rudy Giuliani, who is there in person in Georgia, talking about getting access to voting machines in Georgia before the state legislatures. You have Kathy Latham, who is there claiming whistleblower status, talking about problems in Coffee County, Georgia. And she is represented by Preston Halliburton, who is the attorney who is also representing Giuliani at the same hearing. And of course, Preston Halliburton is the guy who the very next day makes the open records request that initiates the kind of thing that starts all of this. And then also there you have Jovan Pulitzer, who is this former treasure hunter who claims to be an expert at detecting fraudulent ballots.
There had to be a former treasure hunter in this
Of course.
story.
There's another guy who's a former pro surfer. It's it's a lot of interesting characters here. And then you also have, am I missing someone? Giuliani, Halliburton, Kathy Latham, Pulitzer. So you have all those people in the same room. I mean, at the same time, it's also very interesting because there's a few other people who are there who are now indicted in Fulton County in terms of the broader RICO scheme. But you've got those four individuals in the same room at the same time talking about voting machines. And then the very next day, that's when Preston Halliburton initiates the written invitation. And then the day after that, Catherine Freese writes the text message to the Sullivan Strickler employees in which she says, we got a written invitation. I just landed back in DC with the mayor, and I'm putting details together with Phil Waldron, Jovan Pulitzer, Preston Halliburton. So at least two of those people that she's putting details together with had literally been in the same room with Giuliani and Latham 2 days before. So it seems like that's relevant in terms of figuring out how did this plan come about, or when did it come about? Those are the kinds of things.
And what was the scope of it?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So how much about this hearing and this gathering that is associated with the hearing appears in the GBI report?
It doesn't appear at all. And I mean, there are details too that I wasn't able to include in the piece. And so maybe that's for another time, but it's, there's interesting connections insofar, Jovan Pulitzer says that after that hearing, he on social media post, he says that he stayed in Georgia. And there are photos in which he's with Patrick Byrne, who Patrick Byrne says in his book that he flew to Georgia on New Year's Eve after a call from Scott Hall, who, is the bail bondsman who ultimately flew down to Coffee County on January 7th. So there's all these kind of other details as well that just are easily discoverable. But it seems like, the GBI, they just didn't include anything about the legislative hearing, which surely they knew about. So it's very odd.
All right. So what is basket number 3? Basket number 3 involves a jet and the MyPillow guy.
Right.
Like, how did he get involved in this?
Well, I have no idea because it's something, again, that kind of goes a question that is left unanswered. But in terms of what the GBI does say about Mike Lindell, who of course is the CEO and founder of MyPillow, which is the pillow company that is on Fox News a lot. The Pillow Empire, I should say. He's on Fox News a lot. He has his own, I think it's called Frank TV, which is kind of a TV or online network that's basically devoted to them talking about election fraud stuff. And so he is this guy who, is known to be an election conspiracy theorist. He got involved at some point in the post-election period with some Trump campaign activities and funding different kind of efforts to get access to elections data. And there's this really just odd kind of subplot in which Mike Lindell's private jet on the very night that Misty Hampton, the election supervisor, resigns. She purportedly resigned for falsifying her timesheets, but, she resigns. And then the very night that she resigns in February of 2021, Mike Lindell's private jet, according to the GBI report, makes a sudden kind of stop as it flies from DC to Texas to the municipal airport in Douglas, Georgia.
So I got to say, I don't find that strange at all. When I am flying from, Texas to Florida, I often stop in Coffee County on the spur of the moment to meet with pillow entrepreneurs. Wasn't that what Mike Lindell was doing?
Well, Mike Lindell, and this is what's interesting, is that the GBI does not note that, because the Washington Post first reported this kind of odd coincidence of, or maybe not coincidence, of Mike Lindell, his private jet landing in Douglas, Georgia, for 2 hours the night Misty resigns. And he told them that he was meeting with pillow entrepreneurs about prototypes for cooling pillow samples or cooling towels.
Yeah, that's just what one does. You make during a flight, you make an unscheduled stop to talk to pillow entrepreneurs in rural counties not known for pillow production, right?
Right. So, I mean, surely that's what we do. But the odd thing is, and the GBI report does not mention what Lindell told the Washington Post, which was, an article that kind of is how the Coffee County breach really became publicly known from that article. So surely they have read it. But the GBI report instead interviewed this man named Eddie Cheney, who's a part-time airport employee. And he told them that on the day that Lindell landed in Douglas, Cheney knew Mike Lindell because he's someone who, himself is kind of a fan of Mike Lindell. So he knew who he was, he recognized him. And according to Eddie Cheney in the GBI report, and then I also interviewed him, after we got the report, according to Cheney, who is a part-time airport employee, who, saw Mike Lindell come in that evening. He said that at the time, Mike Lindell said that he was there to attend an event at Atkinson County High School. Atkinson County High School is one of the local high schools in the area. It's where Misty, is an alumni of that school. And I understand that at the time her children, or one of her children, was attending that school. I don't know if that is, again, another coincidence or not, but regardless, there's just some, and there's some other things in the piece people can read about.
You reached out to
mm-hmm.
Mike Lindell,
yes.
And what did he tell you he was doing there?
So Mike Lindell insisted when I spoke to him that he was there to meet with MyPillow product vendors, or he said he was probably there to meet with product vendors. He said that, however, when I asked him about this, explanation that Eddie Cheney gave about Atkinson County High School, Mike Lindell told me that, he has given speeches at high schools in the past. He doesn't recall that one, but, he wanted
possible.
to, but it's possible.
Yeah, just an unscheduled stop to do an event at a high school and meet with pillow entrepreneurs or product vendors.
Right. And he also told me that he would not give me the contact information for the so-called vendors because he said that, media attention has kind of caused him to lose business and fractured some of the relationships that he has with those vendors. And then he also told me that he does not know Misty Hampton, and that when I asked him, well, what was the deal with her? The night that he arrived, she had the MyPillow website in her browser, according to some text messages that we reviewed. And he said, well, maybe she likes MyPillow.
I think that seems very likely. All right. So I know what every listener is thinking, having been bombarded with this barrage of information, which is Anna Bauer a crazy person who puts push pins in her walls and makes connections between things with string between the push pins? So, first of all, are you nuts? And secondly, if not, why is this important? It's pretty far. We're pretty far down a rabbit hole here. Bring us up to the top of the hill. Why should people care if the investigation by the GBI of the Coffee County angle of the Fulton County indictment is or is not adequate? Right.
Okay. So let's start with the, am I a conspiracy theorist? I will admit that there are parts of reporting on and writing about this story that kind of have made me feel like one occasionally, because I do feel a little bit like that meme of the guy with like all the bulletin board and all the red like strings kind of connecting the dots. But I mean, can you be a conspiracy theorist if the conspiracy has already been alleged by, I mean, there is an alleged conspiracy that is in the Fulton County indictment.
Right.
So,
it literally alleges a conspiracy.
It literally alleges a conspiracy. And I think that it is important for, people to know whether or not their law enforcement agencies are thoroughly and completely investigating something that is, or as alleged in the Fulton County indictment, constitutes a very serious crime. It alleges that there was a conspiracy between local officials and loyalists to the then president of the United States and his legal team, who then conspired to unlawfully take and distribute voting system data. And there are many election security experts who say that the consequences of the Coffee County breach could be something that, increases the risk of threats to future elections. They point to things like the ability to manipulate legitimate data to create disinformation campaigns. They also point to some of the security issues in that anyone who has access to this software effectively, can search for vulnerabilities or ways to attack it with malware at future elections. So, it's a serious crime. There are potentially serious consequences. And the Fulton County case, that investigation has always been something that has been jurisdictionally limited. Fulton County, of course, is usually bound to the jurisdictional limits of Fulton County itself, because the district attorney was able to kind of craft a RICO indictment that did allow her to expand beyond the usual jurisdictional limits of Fulton County. But it's very clear from that indictment that she is still trying to tie the events in Coffee County very closely to Fulton County by, for example, writing that Sullivan Strickler, the forensics team, is a company that is incorporated or based in Fulton County. And then, of course, there's just resource concerns. Fani Willis, as a county level district attorney, has more limited resources than the GBI or federal law enforcement.
So your concern basically is that nobody except the GBI and maybe Jack Smith, the special counsel, though there's no evidence that he's been interested in this subject at all, nobody really has an interest in investigating the whole conspiracy. Except the GBI, and they didn't do it.
Right. That's exactly what it is.
In other words, kind of like the old Yiddish expression, even paranoids have enemies, which is sometimes translated as, if they're really out to get you, it's not paranoia. The paranoia is just good thinking, right? You're saying if there really is a conspiracy theorizing is actually perfectly reasonable.
Right. Conspiracy theorizing is perfectly reasonable. Although I wouldn't say that I'm theorizing.
You're following evidence.
Right.
It's called reporting.
Right. It's called reporting. And I'm not making any, grand conclusions about, who exactly did what or who's the mastermind or that kind of thing. I mean, I'm just pointing out that there is a lot of publicly available information or information that is just easily findable
that a reasonable investigator would want to have taken. So I just want to say, as the editor of this story, the person who actually had to figure out whether the dots on the wall really connect, they actually all do. And I'm, of course, teasing you about it. but I would not have published it if I didn't think the points are extremely cogent, and some of them take a little bit of intimacy with the evidence in order to understand, which is why the piece is as long as it is. But yeah, you do come away from it with a sense that this investigation was quite deficient and that there's a lot more to this story. I'm not sure you've created that much hypothesis about what the missing pieces are, but that there are missing pieces is very, very clear.
Right.
All right, so what happens now? The GBI has done its report. It's in the hands of the Attorney General. Should we be looking for action by Chris Carr? Is there ongoing investigative activity? What happens now?
It's really unclear. All that is publicly known is that Chris Carr has the report and that he is in the process of reviewing it. And his office has said that they continue to coordinate with the GBI. So it is very unclear at this point, when decisions might be made or what decisions he could make in terms of continuing investigation or seeking potential indictments. If I had to guess, I would say that it may be the case that the Attorney General's office lets the Fulton County case run its course. I am not entirely convinced that there will be any more that comes of it.
On that note, we will leave it there, leave the listener in suspense, check back the next time somebody dumps 400 pages that don't say very much in your lap. Anna Bauer, the story is what the GBI missed in Coffee County. At almost 400 pages, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation report on the Coffee County caper looks impressive. It's not. Anna Bauer, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Our audio engineer this episode was me. I did it myself. Look, our promotions department. The engineer was me. The promotions department is you. So get out there and X about the Lawfare podcast. Send out truth socials about the Lawfare podcast. Gab about the Lawfare podcast. Share Pinterest pins about the Lawfare podcast. Spread the word, whatever you do, because that's how we bring new people into the light. The Lawfare podcast is edited by the estimable Jen Patja Howell. Our music is performed by the now Istanbul-based Sophia Yan. And as always, thanks for listening.